Uprising, Chapter 33, Jane, page 299. Jane stamped out the fire at the bottom of her skirt, and then she was so proud of herself. Look, she wanted to tell someone, I did this. I didn't fall into a dead faint at the horror of it all. I didn't scream hysterically for a servant or man to help me. I put out the fire all on my own. But there was no one to tell, and there were flames all around her. She could see Bella disappearing into the stairwell and almost called out, No, wait, stay with me. But Bella, loyal to the end, would probably turn around and come back if Jane had called her. Jane couldn't do that. Isabella couldn't endanger her when she was only seconds away from safety. I'll be fine on my own, Jane told herself. I'm not some ignorant immigrant shirtwaist girl frightened out of her wits. I can think about this logically and reasonably. A towering wall of flames now stood between Jane and the stairs that Bella had used. So I'll go back to the elevator I took before, wonder which operator I'll get, the swarthy man or the pimply boy who winked at me. Jane was forcing herself to stay calm, to think about things that didn't matter, because if she had to think of things that didn't matter, she wasn't really in danger here. She didn't have to worry. Around her, people were panicking, screaming, and scrambling away from the front flames. Into the cloakroom! We'll be safe in the cloakroom, one boy yelled. And there were actually people who followed him into the cramped, small room. Jane wanted to tell them that they needed to find another sanctuary, that anyone in the cloakroom was doomed. But the flames were already climbing the cloakroom walls. She couldn't get close enough to tell the people inside anything. And anyhow, her feet were carrying her across the room in a frantic dash for the elevator. She didn't have the breath to say anything to anyone. Should have left my corset behind when I ran away from home. She couldn't pretend anymore that her thoughts were logical and reasonable. They were disjointed, chaotic, haunted. The flames around her twisted and intertwined and multiplied just as randomly. For a second, Jane could see Miss Milhouse's scornful countenance looming ahead of her in the fire. She could hear Miss Milhouse's voice in her head scolding her, telling her it was her own fault she got caught in this fire. Whatever did you expect associating with shirtwaist girls? Jane spat into the fire, the most uncouth, ill-mannered act of her life. I will not think your thoughts anymore, Miss Milhouse, she screamed, her voice miraculously back again. Through the smoke now, she could see the elevator right in front of her, the doors open, the pimply elevator operator helping workers in. Wait for me, Jane sobbed. Oh, please wait for me. A huge crowd stood between Jane and the elevator, all screaming and shoving their way in. Oh, but you have to save me, Jane yelled. Don't you know who I am? She stopped. What was she going to say? I'm Jane Wellington from a rich family. I'm the blonde girl's governess. I'm planning to go to college. I'm due a grand tour of Europe. What did any of that matter? Why was her life worth more than anyone else's? The elevator doors were closing. The workers nearest the doors jammed their arms and legs between the doors. They leaped onto the top of the elevator. They slid down the elevator cables. They jumped down the elevator shaft. Jane wasn't close enough to do any of that. He'll come back, won't he? Jane asked. Won't he? Nobody answered. Jane looked behind her. The flames were so close now. To keep away from them, she had to cram in tightly against the other people, scrawny boys and dazed-looking girls and women with the world's weight of sorrow in their eyes. Oh, Jane breathed a catch in her throat. I don't want to die. None of us do, darling, an old woman said. She was a crone in a tattered shawl, clutching beads and murmuring, Hail Mary, full of grace. But she stopped her prayers for a moment and drew Jane into a hug. She's probably somebody's mother, Jane thought. There will be children who will be crying when she's gone. Children and maybe grandchildren, too, all sobbing, missing her. Mama, Jane whispered into the strange woman's smoky shawl. She stayed in the woman's embrace, packed in with all the other workers. The elevator didn't come back. The elevator didn't come back. The elevator didn't come back. So this is how it ends, Jane thought. She banished Miss Milhouse's thoughts from her mind, but she knew how her father and Mrs. Milhouse and all of society would view this. Jane dying with the shirtwaist workers in the embrace of a crone with a shawl and a rosary. Her death would be seen as a defeat, a disgrace, a sign that girls who run away from home always come to a bad end. No, Jane thought, no. She saw that she'd expected to go back someday. Sending a letter to her father would have been her first step. When she got tired of living on pickled herring and pasta, she might have compromised her principles, might have let Mr. Corrigan stage a prodigal daughter reunion with her father. Her father probably would have taken her back, or she might have saved her money, worked her way up to teaching at a school, worked her way into college, and married one of her classmates' brothers, someone like that uninformed law student, Charles Livingston. And back in high society, she would be that daring girl who spent the years slumming it in the tenements. She'd be like that matronly grandmother who'd once worked as a spy in the war, the picture of propriety with the shocking past. No, Jane thought again. None of that would happen now. She would die pure, her principles intact, society shunned. This too can be seen as a triumph, Jane thought. Jane and the crone and the shawl and all the other workers had slumped down to the floor because there wasn't any air left anywhere else. They were all lying together, but Jane made sure that she had moved her hand to the top of the pile so that anyone who found them would see her signet ring, would see that it wasn't just poor people who died. The tragedy of the working conditions threatens us all, Jane heard the Vassar suffrage say that day during the shirtwaist strike. Back when Jane was a foolish rich girl in a frilly dress. She hadn't understood the words then, any more than she understood the fire now. But she felt connected to the crone in the shawl, the pimply elevator operator, the boy who thought the cloakroom was a safe haven, and Bella and Yetta and Millicent and Harriet Blanc. All of them were threatened by the fire escape that fell away from the building, by the block stairway, by the tiny elevators that served the entire 10-story building. All of them were threatened by this fire. Around her, the workers were screaming out prayers and curses, screaming, then murmuring, then just moving their lips, their words only known to God. Jane discovered that she herself was sobbing tearlessly, or maybe her tears were evaporating in the heat the moment her eyes produced them. Her only prayer was still, I don't want to die. Oh, please, God, don't let me die, she thought. I've never even had a chance to live. Or had she? Jane remembered that day so long ago when she'd been on her way to tea in Washington Square, just as the Triangle workers were spilling out in their factory. She'd been so taken with the sight of them. She'd envied them without understanding why. She believed now that she'd probably witnessed their first attempt at a strike, their first heady moment, excuse me, of standing up for themselves, of challenging the men in power. They looked so alive that day, so full of life. Everything she'd done since then had been a quest to fill her own life with meaning. She'd gone from lying uselessly in bed to standing on the picket line watching, to taking in Bella, and then she'd stood up for herself. She taught Harriet, Millicent. Oh, Lord, I hope I taught them something. She'd learned to appreciate a single red rose with Yetta and Bella. But I'm not finished yet. I'm not finished. The fire was inches from her skirt, and there was nowhere left to go. The air was nothing but smoke. The elevator wasn't coming back. I am finished, Jane thought, but it wasn't like she was giving up. Giving up would have been marrying whatever boy her father had picked out for her, drinking tepid tea for the rest of her life with women she didn't even like. This was more like a blaze of glory, seeing all her choices tallied up, seeing what her life had meant. I was alive, she thought. I lived. I mattered. She squeezed in tighter against the old woman in the shawl, hugging the crone as she always wanted to hug her own mother. The crone and the other workers had also lived, had also mattered, and now they were also dying. All of them were dying together. It's the end of chapter 33.